for taking time to be with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Professor Papanikolaou, why don't we start with you? And can you tell us how we got here? And
I don't know if I can speak to all the dimensions of how we got here, but one of the dimensions has to do with the role of religion. And I think in some of the media coverage of it, I think that element has not been sort of talked about enough. I do think there is more now. There's sort of more reporting on that particular dimension. But let me at least speak a little bit about the role of religion is playing. I don't want to take too long, but let me try to give some bullet points. So I think it's helpful to go back to the fall of communism. You see the fall of communism, things transform in Russia. And one of the things that has to be realized is that Russia does have a very rich religious history, and that religious history is Orthodox Christianity. It goes back to the story of Prince Vladimir and sending emissaries and going into the great church of Saint Sophia in Constantinople, and that famous phrase, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." And Orthodox Christianity sort of moving north to some extent, and the center of that was Kiev, and then it sort of moved further eastward towards Moscow and what we know today as Russia, Ukraine, and Russia. So, it has since that time, in the 10th century, it's had a very rich religious history and relationship to Christianity. And of course, as we all know, that came to a grinding halt with the communists, literally a grinding halt with the communists in around 1917, of course. And it's fair to say, I mean, it's a complicated history, but it's fair to say that one of the things the communists, they didn't succeed in eviscerating religion as they sort of wished to, or even the institutional Orthodox Church, but they did succeed in delinking Russian identity from its Orthodox Christian identity, whereas prior to the communists, that was a very strong link. To be Russian was to be Orthodox Christian. The communists succeeded in delinking that. So the big question after the fall of communists, and this has everything to do with what's happening in Ukraine, so bear with me. The big issue after the fall of communism is, well, what would happen? Would that link be kind of sewn together again? And I would say the Russian Orthodox Church fought very, very hard to establish that link again, and it took quite a long time. And incrementally, I think they slowly but surely succeeded, right? But I think the big payday, if you will, for them came around 2012 when Vladimir Putin started to really appropriate this history, its symbols, its stories, its imagery into his own rhetoric. He really started to do that. And to some extent, when that happened, one could say that a relinking of Russian and Orthodox identity occurred. To be Russian was to be Orthodox, and that is proven by some polls which show that about 75 to 80% of Russians, when they were asked, identified as Orthodox Christian. Now, it's absolutely the case that none of them go. They don't go to church. Maybe they barely practice. But to some extent, that's somewhat irrelevant because let's say in other Orthodox countries, like in Greece, it's a very similar phenomenon. Like 90% identify as Orthodox, but you actually have atheists identifying as Orthodox. I know that's hard for Americans to understand, but there's this kind of cultural orthodoxy that was reestablished in Russia. Now, how does that sort of impact what's happening with Ukraine? Well, again, Vladimir Putin has sort of appropriated this history. And one way of seeing that history, which he has sort of projected onto the world, is that there is this kind of Russian world, right? This Russian world that's beyond the borders of Russia that encompasses Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And this helps explain to some extent his own rhetoric that there is this kind of oneness between the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia, and that there is this bond that they have, and sort of intermixed a little bit with that rhetoric is this sense that Ukraine is being seduced by the West, by Europe, by the West, but but more importantly, it's being seduced away from its own religious roots, right? That, I mean, just recently, the Patriarch Kirill, the patriarch of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church, gave this sermon on Sunday where he basically defended what was happening, and of course they're framing it there in terms of a military operation and not an invasion, not a war, but framed it in terms of language, basically saying that to be a member of Europe, and we're trying to save Ukraine from like moving to the dark side, because ultimately that will mean they'll have gay parades in their streets. I mean, this is sort of the language that's being used, and even Putin's own rhetoric to some extent has tried to differentiate Russia from Europe, from the West, and by using this language of traditional values, that basically they are a country with this, rich religious heritage. It's part of their identity, and part of that is ultimately to differentiate themselves from this, from this godless Western European nation. So key to this. So part of the rhetoric. So part of the justifying rhetoric to what he's doing has something to do with this kind of religious history, and again, it has something to do with the fact that there has been some success within Russia of relinking this Russian and religious identity, but trying to encompass it more broadly and including sort of the Ukrainian people, which is, again, a complicated history there. Now, one last thing. There's also an event that occurred over the past few years where the our ecumenical patriarch was in Constantinople. He granted and established and gave what's called a tomos to establish the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So they gave them sort of independent status. But this church would be independent from the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, the Moscow Patriarchate has seen Ukraine as part of its own religious jurisdiction. This created a tremendous rift in the Orthodox world. But what's interesting is that Putin himself, when this happened, actually called a meeting of the Security Council and saw this event as some kind of threat to Russia's security. So, that's an event that really reverberated more internally within the Orthodox world. But again, it's just language, events, images, symbols that are being appropriated in some way, some form, and are part of the picture. Definitely NATO, definitely, Russia's security and economic concerns and all those play a role, but it would be naive to think somehow religion is not also a part of the game. Not to mention the fact, I'm sorry, I know I said one last thing, but this is the last thing. Not to mention the fact that you really do have, Ukraine is mostly Orthodox. Of course, there is a very large segment of Catholics, Greek Catholics, but you really do have, Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Christians, at least by name, by identification, sort of now up against each other. And again, it would be naive to think that that's not at play when citizens are being attacked and bombed, that somehow, thinking about this religious identity in relationship to the people who are attacking them is somehow not in play as they're trying to protect themselves. So,
thank you so much, Professor Papanikolaou. Professor Prodromou, you have not only been a scholar in this area, but you've also been a practitioner. In what ways do you see religion influencing and playing itself out in this conflict?
Well, just to follow on many of the things that Professor Papanikolaou mentioned, I wanted to sort of put things in a broader geopolitical framework and think about geopolitics in a couple of ways. First, in terms of the more conventional understanding of geopolitics, and there look at a little bit about the timeline and conjunctural moments that help us to understand how there's been a real evolution in the relationship between Russia and the transatlantic alliance, in particular NATO, and the US and its European partners, from, I think, a relationship of possibility that could lead to peace and security in Europe and Eurasia, to the current moment, which is the war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine, and the endangerment not only of European security, but of global security from that war. and then geopolitics in the second sense, and that gets to religion, but they're intertwined. And that's the geopolitics of religion, particularly some of the points that Professor Papanikolaou mentioned when it comes to inter-Orthodox issues, but broader, I would say, Christian ecumenical issues and the ties to state actors, real and perceived. And I also just want to start because I think that by saying, hopefully we can all stipulate to a couple of things. I mean, first of all, everyone agrees, except for Vladimir, of course, and those who support him, that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is, a violation of all standards of international law, and especially the foundational principle of sovereignty, and that the war is a decision by Putin, the political class and the religious class that support him, and key private sector actors who support the war of aggression against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I think we can all agree on that. And hopefully we can all agree that the single priority of the international community, and by that I mean states, the NATO alliance, the European Union, multilateral organizations, the UN, but also religious actors around the world, should be to prevent escalation and expansion of the war. And I say that because I think what we're seeing now is something very, very dangerous, what historians call war fever. And I think we're seeing it in media coverage, in the US, internationally, certainly in Russia. And that war fever, unfortunately, can generate escalation and expansion rather than cessation and some sort of good faith negotiations to bring assistance, humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian people and a durable peace. So how do we get to that, and where does religion figure? Just a couple of general points about the trajectory, the geopolitical trajectory. The interesting thing is, if we go back to the end of the Cold War, and I think that's our timeline that is most immediately relevant, there were real opportunities for engagement and positive relations between Russia on the one hand and the NATO alliance on the other. And those have devolved over time to this broken, hostile, antithetical relationship. And scholars like John Mearsheimer, like Andrew Bacevich, they've written about this in great detail, the moments of possibility. And also, great diplomats, those living and those past, for example, the late, great George Kennan, who was the architect of containment theory, have written about and former US Defense Secretary Bill Perry under the Clinton administration, they've written about these moments of lost opportunity. And all of them center on the question of promises made or not made, interpretations understood or misunderstood about whether or not the US and NATO more generally would enlarge eastward. And this is really at the crux of the issue when it comes to the war in Ukraine in terms of geopolitical and territorial questions. And it's interesting that in 1997 and then in 1998, the late George Kennan described the decision to enlarge eastward in NATO as the single worst foreign policy decision that the United States had ever made. And he went on to say that, this will provoke a kind of new Cold War. It'll provoke reactions on the part of Russia. It'll enable and embolden anti-democrats inside Russia, a whole host of things. And he said, and then there will likely be violence. And he said, and when there's violence, we will say, oh, well, that's what Russia does. So that's, one perspective. And then on the Russian side, it's interesting to see that, initially both Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, and eventually Putin, even in 2002, floated the idea of Russian membership in the NATO alliance. And they were rebuffed both directly and indirectly, although there was the North Atlantic Cooperation Council between Russia and NATO, and then Russia joined the Partnership for Peace. It appeared that things were not going off the rails completely, but there were other indications that at the geopolitical level, the possibilities for engagement and inclusion were devolving to hostility and exclusion. And ultimately, the key moments that we may want to think about: 2007, Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Council, where he basically rejected an international order, he said, led by American hegemony. and all of the, kind of anti-Western rhetoric that went along with that. And then in 2008, of course, Russia's invasion of Georgia and, occupation of two of the Georgian republics. And then in 2014, Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea, etc., the first piece of the dismemberment of Ukraine. And that led to a full freezing and rupture of Russia-NATO relations. So there's the big geopolitics. Where does religion fit in that? We see, a deterioration, a steady deterioration in the intra-Orthodox world that's related to, and Professor Papanikolaou alluded to this, but it's related to geopolitics. In 2016, at the Holy and Great Council in Crete, Russia decided to boycott that, that council, and pressured 3 other Orthodox churches not to attend. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. And then in August of 2016, Russia launched a kind of disinformation campaign accusing Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of being a tool of the CIA, connecting him to the coup attempt in Turkey. The disinformation campaign started in Oriental Review, went into Turkish publications. After that, in 2018, there were revelations that Fancy Bear, the Russian state-affiliated hacking organization, hackers had hacked into the emails and electronic communications of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and other Orthodox Christians. And all of that was the lead up to what happened in January of 2019, as Dr. Papanikolaou said, the granting of the Tomos of autocephaly to the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church of Ukraine, Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Why does that matter? Because from the Russian perspective, both state and church, the narrative of these events is first that the Ecumenical Patriarchate's decision was a decision based on his own playing of geopolitics, even though, as Dr. Papanikolaou rightly, and lucidly laid out, the Moscow Patriarchate has been playing its own form of geopolitics, revisionism, aiming to supplant the Ecumenical Patriarchate as the leader, having a primacy of honor in global orthodoxy. And at the same time, the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate, Moscow Patriarchate, utilized its relationship with the Kremlin in order to conduct the kind of disinformation campaign and pressure and coercion that we oftentimes associate with states. And that's now included intimidation tactics like establishing an exarchate in Africa, which the Russian Synod described as retribution for the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate's recognition of the Ukrainian Church, something that in ecclesiological terms is a problem. In religious freedom terms, okay, no problem. But in Orthodox ecclesiological terms, it's seen as a hostile and non-canonical act. And we see threats to do the same in Greece and Cyprus and Israel and Palestinian territories, etc. So what we're seeing is a narrative by the Moscow Patriarchate that links developments inside Orthodoxy to high geopolitics of West versus East, East versus West, and the way that has now informed and led to fragmentation inside the Orthodox world as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you both for those incredibly helpful overviews. For those of you who are watching, if you have questions for Professor Papanikolaou or Professor Prodromou, please send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I wonder what influence religious leaders can have either within Ukraine and Russia or outside. Can the Ecumenical Patriarch, does he have some influence on this, on the trajectory of this conflict? I know that Pope Francis talked to one of the Russian ambassadors as things were flaring up. What can the religious community do?
Yeah, Well, I think whatever impact it might have within Russia, they need to speak up one way or the other, because their silence also has an impact in a much more negative sense. Whatever the religious leaders say, I don't think it will change the internal dynamics, because I'm pretty much sure that the statements made by religious leaders within Russia are for internal consumption. So they have sort of that sort of view in mind. And so just very quickly, there have been various statements by Orthodox Christian leaders, some very strongly kind of naming Putin as an aggressor and an invader, some very strongly calling on the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill to say something to Putin. Other statements have been a little bit more, a little bit less strong, basically referring to the situation or the events, or calling for peace, not naming it as war. Part of that has to do with the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church, it has particular relationships with other Orthodox churches, as maybe your viewership knows. The Orthodox Church doesn't have a pope, but we have sort of a relationship of independent Orthodox churches to one another, mostly drawn along national borders. So, the Russian Orthodox Church has very strong ties to the Serbian Orthodox Church. There is strong financial and economic ties. And so, and the Russian government has strong ties to the Serbian government too. So the geopolitical role plays that way too. In other words, let's say, just as an example, I mean, it's not simply the case that the Patriarch of Serbia is going to make a statement. I mean, he's going to make a statement in conversation with, the leaders of the Serbian government, because it's not just simply internal consumption for the Orthodox Church. It has something to do with geopolitical relations between Serbia and Russia, quite honestly. And so if the Patriarch of Serbia came out really strongly against Putin and against the invasion, then, I mean, that would affect somehow Russian Serbian geopolitical relationships as well. So I do think, however, that as things progress, some of the Orthodox leaders the messages are evolving. The Romanian Patriarch was not as strong early on, but now he's becoming much stronger, because from what I hear, there's intelligence that Russia's next target is Moldova, and so he's probably getting worried. So if the other Orthodox leaders pump up the volume, so to speak, then that I do think that will. I don't think that will change anything, but I think it will change. It will have historical repercussions for the Orthodox churches to follow. It may be. So we spoke about this creation of this independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Most of the Orthodox churches did not acknowledge that that independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They sided with Russia, so to speak. It could very well be that the social capital that the Patriarch Kirill gained through that event is being squandered now, and that seeing that other Orthodox churches may support that church now. And in fact, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was under the Moscow Patriarchate may actually decide that they no longer want to do that. So this could, whatever happens in the war, this could change the landscape of the Orthodox Christian churches' relationships. And I think as the war continues to go on, I think that the volume will be pumped up a little bit more. And I think that will affect, I don't think it'll affect anything in Russia, but it'll affect what happens in the Orthodox world after, whatever happens after this invasion.
I think just to follow up on Professor Papanikolaou's points, I think looking at the internal, what can religious leaders do inside the Orthodox Church? I mean, I think it's incumbent upon them to stand up and condemn war, to condemn violence. I mean, this is irrespective of who's committing the violence. I mean, that's, from my perspective, what every religious leader should do, and certainly any church leader, Orthodox or non-Orthodox. I think the real issue here is what will the Patriarch of Moscow do, Patriarch Kirill. And as Dr. Papanikolaou mentioned, unfortunately, from my perspective, this Sunday that just passed, which is the Sunday of Forgiveness, the first Sunday as Orthodox began Great and Holy Lent on Monday, his sermon, as Dr. Papanikolaou said, Kirill's sermon was all about the West and the dangers of the West because of Western values, which he considers to be decadent and incompatible with his interpretation of Christianity. So I think that the real pressure in some ways is under Patriarch Kirill to either both internally in Russia, from the Russians, the many Russians now who have been arrested, thousands of Russian citizens who have been arrested protesting this war, from Russian artists inside and outside Russia who have publicly signed petitions condemning the war, and also from several hundred Russian Orthodox priests who have really put themselves in the way of retribution, both from the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church, who have come out opposed to the war. So the real question, I think, will be what will Kirill do? And as Dr. Papanikolaou said, I think his silence and his effort to wordsmith condemnation of this war, not even calling it a war, ultimately will produce a boomerang blowback effect for him. For other Orthodox churches, yes, they have. I think many of their leaders take geopolitical considerations first. The Kremlin and the Moscow Patriarchate have used influence building operations that involve lots of material incentives, both transparent and non-transparent in those countries, investments by so-called Orthodox oligarchs and others in those countries, questions related to energy use and therefore what those states do in terms of pressuring Orthodox churches. But as far as I'm concerned, it's incumbent upon them to speak truth to power and condemn this war. I do want to add one footnote, though, that it's interesting to see what's happening in the broader Christian space when it comes to the war. There have been some interesting comments that have come out of some evangelical communities in the United States, including Pat Robertson, who's recently just remarked that this is the beginning of the end times. There are some very interesting transnational relationships between some evangelical Christian communities, for example, Liberty University and the Moscow Patriarchate, who see Russian Orthodox interpretation of what it means to be traditional and conservative, and Putin and Kirill as defenders of authentic Christianity. And what does that mean? Pushing back, taking an anti-abortion stand, an anti-inclusion on LGBTQ issues, etc. So there are these other transnational religious voices that in some ways will also be important in condemning this war. And then finally, just a last point about what can religious leaders do or not do. I think, it's important for religious leaders not to act like states. And by that, I simply mean that the sanctions that have been imposed on Putin and some of his inner circle and oligarchs and against Russian private and state companies, that a sanction approach towards the Russian Orthodox Church, including, suggestions about expelling them from, multi-faith institutions, etc. From my perspective, I'm not sure whether that's very prudent. It essentializes all Russian Orthodox Christians and penalizes them because of their patriarch and those, hierarchs around him. And certainly from a Christian perspective, if we're thinking about the fullness of the ecclesial body, to put it in those terms, cutting off literally millions of Russian Orthodox Christians from and closing them out of those kinds of organizations, again, because of the abject failures and inexcusable, whatever the opposite of courage is. It's been such a long day, I can't remember, cowardice of their religious leaders. I'm not sure whether that's really a prudent way to go.
I will, just if I can add really fast, I don't know if you've seen this, Peter, but Rowan Williams, of course, former Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote in the Times, I believe, of London. He writes, last weekend, Orthodox Christians in many countries celebrated Forgiveness Sunday. That was just this past Sunday, the day before Great Lent. Many will have hoped to hear from the Orthodox Church in Russia some acknowledgement of the shocking, not to say blasphemous, absurdity of Orthodox Christians engaging at this season of all seasons in indiscriminate killing of the innocent, insanely reckless attacks on nuclear facilities, the unashamed breach of ceasefire agreements, and an attack on one of the most significant Holocaust memorials in Europe. It is not too late for the leadership of the Church of Russia to call for a credible ceasefire as Lent begins. Those of us who owe a lasting debt to the thought and witness of Christian Russia through the centuries find it hard to believe that all the moral norms of warfare, painstakingly explored by Christians in both East and West, from the earliest sages onwards, have been forgotten. So there from your own world spiritual leader is a pretty direct, and of course he's a recognized expert on Orthodox Christianity and many aspects of Russian culture.
We'll try to put a link to that article in the chat so
Great.
folks can read it for themselves.
Great.
And the precision of the language of the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think, is so important, again, because he literally hones in on the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think, that's very, very, very important, because they are either guilty by complicity or by omission in terms of what they say and do. But again, I think it's important for all of us to deconstruct and not reduce every, Orthodox Christian in Russia to Patriarch Kirill and his clique, for lack of a more generous way to put it.
Yeah.
We have a number of really interesting questions. I don't know that we'll have time to get to them all. Professor Prodromou, you mentioned the connections between conservative leaders in Russia and conservative leaders in the religious space in the US. And I wonder if you all can speak to the similarities and the differences in terms of the confluence of right-wing politics and right-wing religion in the two countries.
Why don't you take this one, Elizabeth?
Okay, I can start, and then you can follow up. Again, I think what's important is that we do see these they're not always visible, but they're very active. And again, they go back to before the end of the Cold War, but certainly since the end of the Cold War. The engagement at the religious level, I won't say theological level, but at the religious level. And by that I mean, missionaries going to Russia, collaborative relationships between Russian Orthodox parishes and evangelical Christian missionaries coming into Russia. We see a convergence of, I would call it more of a religious ideology than a theology. I think, paradoxically, in terms of the way in which the Russian Orthodox and the evangelical Christians understand or misunderstand their theology, it's largely misunderstand, and there the twains will meet. But where they have converged, certainly at the elite levels, has been in this view, that this consensus view that the enemies of Christianity are aggressive anti-religious secularism. So the term secular becomes just a placeholder in which the main filler is anti-religion. That's the only way it's understood. And all of the putative decadence that goes along with Western values, and those include the things that we mentioned earlier. And that's really the ideological level at which we've seen transnational networks and relationships between these two church communities. The other thing too is there's, to put it in the vernacular, there's a lot of money to be made in those relationships. And so we see at the level of economic and business elites, and then also at the grassroots level in terms of shared investments, et cetera, those relationships that are based on this religious ideology that we associate, I think, with the political right, whatever these terms mean anymore in our Orwellian world, but with the political right. And we also see the financial relationships that go along with them. But it's that shared defensive, hostile view, religious view towards the modern and postmodern world that really is the overlap in that Venn diagram.
And there's the nationalistic element. I mean, I think Americans are awakening up to the fact that there was this latent sort of what's called Christian nationalism, and there's been some really good research on the fact that the people identified with this Christian nationalism are pushing it aren't actually very religious, but they have this idea of sort of a kind of identity of what America's about, how it has this Christian sort of identity to it, its history, etc. Again, just appropriating symbols and imageries and stories, very similar in the way that what's happening, I think, in Russia, but also disturbingly in a way how this nationalistic impulse just simply overrides any kind of democratic impulse. I mean, here in the United States, this kind of Christian national impulse will pretend that it's somehow defending democracy, but it's clear that they're not. In Russia, Putin also to some extent pretends like he has a democracy, but it's very clear that he just despises it. And so, yeah, and this kind of nationalistic impulse also leads to some, anyway, on the far right, not all, but some, seeing Putin as this kind of great leader, as Russia is going to come save, the United States. And this is particularly evident in some circles within the Orthodox Christian world. There are converts that convert to Orthodox Christianity, and they see somehow Putin and what's happening in Russia as this reemergence of this glorious Tsarist empire, right? So they paint this glorious Tsarist image in their minds, and they love it. They love it, and they probably want to see something similar happen in the United States as well. So they make no secret of the fact that they want a certain kind of imposed Christian cultural political identity, and so I think there's some similarities there.
One of our viewers asks what theologies of just war might exist within the Orthodox tradition, and are any of them being employed to justify the war in Ukraine?
So the Orthodox Church never really formally kind of developed what's called a just war theory. And there's a very good book that explores this, and actually Elizabeth and myself are contributors to it, called Orthodox Perspectives on War. So I encourage your viewers to maybe look at that book. But what's interesting is this: the Russian Orthodox Church came out in 2000 with something called the Social Concept of the Orthodox Church, and we run this e-publication called Public Orthodoxy, which I recommend to your viewers. And we've gotten people actually have written to us saying that someone's got to write that based on its own document, right? Based on its own social concept document, in which they make some comments about war and just war. Even though we don't really have a just war tradition, they make some comments about war and when war is justifiable and that kind of thing. Based on its own document, this war is not justified, right? It's based on its own internal reflection. 22 years ago, there's no justifying this war. So there's the inner contradiction of having a document like this and then being put in a situation now where they seem to be backed into a corner where they can all they can really do is support sort of state propaganda.
Just to follow up on that and to go back to the volume that Dr. Papanikolaou mentioned, I have my contribution in there is actually co-authored with Dr. Alexandros Kiro, and we write about the concept of war in the Byzantine Orthodox Empire. And if you look at the documents and the practices in that period of time, it was very clear that the early church never developed and indeed rejected the notion of a just war, and that Orthodox theology believes that war is a reflection of the fallen condition. It's the irreconcilable tragedy of the post-lapsarian condition. And as a consequence, then, the idea that defensive wars were a reflection of that tragic condition, the church developed all sorts of mechanisms to deal with that, tragic contradiction. So, for example, soldiers, returning from war were not allowed to partake in the Eucharist for a certain period of time, certain confessional requirements, the development of standards about how to treat prisoners of war and allow prisoners of war to have, their own worship practices. So that there's never been a just war or even a justifiable war tradition in the Orthodox faith. But what's interesting is that under Putin and under Patriarch Kirill, there's been a real effort to develop a theology of just war. And a really interesting book to go as companion with the one that Professor Papanikolaou mentioned is Dmitry Adamski's book, Nuclear Orthodoxy. And we've seen the effort to develop in the foreign ministry of the Russian Orthodox Church a theology of just, at least justifiable, if not just war. But again, that represents a real break, and according to most theologians, of which I am not a theologian, but and so far as I read theology, represents a something that's a rupture and a distortion of the Orthodox tradition.
We'll try to keep up and put those books in the chat so people have access to them. So another person wonders if there are theological differences between the kind of newly recognized independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, or is this mostly due to kind of ecclesial and international politics, the fact that there was this split?
No, there's no theological differences. There's debate about who can grant this independence, who can grant this autocephaly. That's a really complicated story, but there's no theological differences. But you have, what's interesting about, so we have this word in Orthodox Church called autocephaly, this idea that we're sort of independent jurisdictionally, but we're united by faith. It's a very powerful word, a very powerful phrase. And what's interesting, what's really interesting is that it's a bit ironic to some extent. I mean, Putin is appropriating this sort of religious history and the symbols as a way of justifying his invasion, as keeping Ukraine religious roots, reuniting, a common people and that kind of stuff. But all he's doing is strengthening, in many ways, a real sense of difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians. I mean, before the war, there really were sort of people in Ukraine that sympathized with Russia. They were pro-Russian, actually. I would be hard-pressed to find anyone within Ukraine at this moment that has any sympathy for Russia. I mean, I was listening to an NPR report, and one of the things that was being reported, at least within the bunkers, is just the vitriol, the hatred, that the anger that people are feeling for something that seems so senseless and ridiculous and tragic. So what's ironic is that, in his effort to try to really, unite Orthodox Christians, I guess, at least that's part of the rhetoric, he's actually creating the impetus for people to want to just not have anything to do with the Russian Orthodox Church. And the same thing is happening in Belarus. I mean, it's not quite strong, but there are Belarusians, who see the creation of an independent Belarusian church as a way of signaling a difference from Russian identity. And to some extent, it's very sad. It's very sad because, we're all Christians here, and we really should be focusing on a sense of how it is that we can be united, how this common identity can really be enough to keep us from engaging in this kind of aggression and violence. But I hope and I pray that there are resources within our faith that after this, perhaps we can move towards a kind of unity and reconciliation that ultimately is what we're called to do. So I hope so.
We do have a few more minutes for additional questions. So again, feel free to send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Can you all speak to the perhaps religious significance of Kiev for Russians? I guess both from a religious and from a secular perspective.
Yeah, do you want to take that one, Elizabeth? I spoke last time.
Sure, I can start. As again, as Telly pointed out at the beginning, the conversion, the embrace of Christianity happened at Kiev, and Kiev and Rus therefore is considered the wellspring of Christianity in the Russian space. And the Russian space here, I would say, refers to what are the contemporary states of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And so Kiev holds a particularly crucial symbolic, but also historical place in Orthodoxy amongst the Russian-speaking, now different languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian, even to an extent, peoples. And so the granting of the Tomos of self-governance of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was seen by, or was presented at least by the Patriarchate of Moscow as an act that tore apart the organic body of the Russian people originating from Christian Russian people originating from Kiev. The ecclesiastical developments that led to the relocation, the historical and ecclesiastical developments that led to the relocation of the Russian Orthodox Church from Kiev to Moscow, and the Muscovite Patriarchate, the Muscovite Patriarchate, are ones that, in terms of the discussion about whether or not to grant autocephaly, were taken into account. So the 17th century decision that granted the move from Kiev to Moscow was seen as a temporary, albeit now almost 4 centuries, in length, a temporary remove because of local historical and geopolitical circumstances. The Patriarchate of Moscow does not accept that. They don't accept that justification for the granting of the Tomos of autocephaly, nor do they accept the primacy of honor of the ecumenical patriarch to convene a council and to make a decision like the granting of autocephaly. But Kiev holds a particularly important historical and symbolic place for Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian Orthodox.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, let's put it this way: Kiev is more important than Moscow and Petersburg. Let's put it that way. Moscow is seen maybe because of the Kremlin and everything else, but Kiev, in terms of the history and the hub, is seen as much more important than Moscow and Petersburg. And look, Ukrainians are very religious people, and so there was very high church attendance. They're much more religious than the Russians are. So, I mean, to some extent, I mean, whether the Patriarch of Moscow, has sort of pastoral leadership over them or not is kind of a big deal, because it's not simply a sizable portion of his jurisdiction; it's also a sizable portion that's fairly active, and fairly involved. So.
One of our commenters wonders if you all can speak on the role of the Serbian War in the former Yugoslavia and that effect it might have had on Putin.
What I'm hearing anyway, and I'll let Elizabeth know more about this, what I'm hearing is not so much that, right, as much as the parallels with the Georgian situation. The difference with the Georgian situation, I think, is that I don't think the sort of the rhetoric of the one people and we have this common history and that kind of thing, that didn't necessarily enter into Putin's own military aggressions into Georgia. But what I've been hearing is that his military incursions into Chechnya and Georgia are, like, he thought that he was just, now this has nothing to do with religion, but he thought that somehow it would be sort of quick and sort of incisive. And I think that what I'm hearing anyway is that there's a certain amount of surprise that it isn't so fast. But maybe Elizabeth is, but in parallels to the Bosnian conflict, I've not been hearing. So.
I think the Kosovo experience actually is relevant. I talked about the deterioration and the possibilities for a Russia, NATO rapprochement, even Russian membership in NATO at some point, and how things began to deteriorate after in the late 1990s. And one of the signal conjunctural moments was the 1990 NATO bombardment of Serbia. And I think it's worth pointing that out because not only was that event important in terms of how Putin began to see, and the Eurasianist school in Russia and the foreign and security policy in Russia began to see the West, the NATO, the transatlantic alliance, but also how religion began to be integrated into the ideas of East versus West or East and West. And most specifically, I think, it's important for us to recall that as we are now roundly condemning, violence in Ukraine, and it's happening at the worst possible time at the start of Lent for Christians, the NATO was bombing Serbia all during Holy Week of Lent in 1999 and during Orthodox Easter, despite the many entreaties of Serbian Orthodox churchmen and the opposition to Slobodan Milosevic to NATO not to bomb during that period in time. And I can say personally, I remember that. I remember being in church worshiping and turning to my husband at that time saying, we're so fortunate here. We're about to celebrate, Easter, and people are being bombed in their churches on Easter. And that memory of that has still very active kind of symbolic valence for the Serbian Orthodox population, and helps to account, I think, for at least at some level, for the sympathies of the Serbian patriarchate. Again, there are other explanatory factors, but that's not something I think that can be minimized. And also, that's a turning point that it's an important conjunctural moment for Putin, who began then to speak a more hostile discourse about the United States as having pretensions to global hegemony. That's a moment when we begin to see that discourse really emerge with some clarity. And I mentioned the Munich Security Conference in 2007, and that's where it really just kind of, comes out in full force, with Putin's rejection of what he calls the United States as a global hegemon, and the United States as a country that wants hegemony not only in Eurasia, not only in the Americas, but in Eurasia and globally. And so the Kosovo War has a lot of both geopolitical value, but also symbolic value and understanding, I think, some of these lost opportunities. And just to add one footnote to that, I think it also speaks to, NATO and the transatlantic alliance real values problem, because NATO is supposed to be an alliance, a defensive alliance, and a community of shared values. And the NATO Charter says that members of NATO are meant to be democracies who uphold, the liberal principles, values, and norms of democracy. And NATO has a very, very serious values problem, not only in terms of some of the, violations of sovereignty of whether we're talking about Kosovo or Iraq or Afghanistan or so many other cases around the world, but also a NATO member state that behaves precisely as Russia does, and that's Turkey, which invaded and occupied in 1974 and until today continues to occupy EU territory in northern Cyprus and perpetrated ethnic and religious cleansing in the occupied areas, has invaded and occupied northern Syria since 2018 and commits atrocities and war crimes there, and occupies portions of northern Iraq. And so when NATO speaks about values, and the values that I think all of us hold dear, universal human rights and rule of law and equality before the state, here comes Vladimir Putin and just holds up a list and says, look at all of these contradictions. And so I think, as we started out, you asked us what faith leaders can do. I think humility on the part of our own political leadership is really important in order to recognize our own values contradictions, to own them, but also to address them and not go to Saudi Arabia to ask, King Mohammed bin Salman, who ordered the killing and dismemberment of an opposition journalist in the Saudi embassy in Turkey to pump more oil to help the United States and the West against Putin, or to now, try to lift sanctions against a Venezuelan government that we imposed sanctions on precisely because of the grotesque human rights violations that we associate with the Putin regime. So I didn't mean to digress, but I think the Kosovo example is very, very rich in terms of what it can help us to think about in terms of not making similar mistakes and holding ourselves accountable so that we can indeed hold violators like Putin, Russia under Putin, accountable with, all of the moral authority that we would want to have.
So we only have a few minutes left. There's a question about President Zelensky of Ukraine's Jewish heritage and the extent to which Judaism and perhaps anti-Semitism has played a role in this conflict. Putin has used the word denazification at some point. I'm wondering if you all have any reflections on that.
I don't, for Putin himself, my sense is that's irrelevant. It's just odd, though, that he tries to push this sort of Nazification story. In other words, that somehow Ukraine has been Nazified, and that's his justification for basically really his end game. It's very difficult to know what his end game is, but obviously one of his end games is to overturn the government. If he's able to overturn the government and somehow install a government that's pro-Russian, even by force, my sense is that the fight, that the intentional combat will stop, but then some form of guerrilla warfare will probably take over. But I think you don't see anything in his rhetoric sort of, well, it would be odd because he's talking in one sense of Nazification, and then you have the Jewish president. So but I do think, though, at the much more subterranean level, quite honestly, for Christians who might support what Putin is doing, they might, in fact, draw on this Jewish identity and basically sort of try to indicate that it's that he's sort of in cahoots with this liberal secular West and all that kind of stuff. So, on the part of Putin, I don't think so. But at the more subterranean discussion of sort of Christians who support what Putin's doing, I do think it enters into the discussion, yes.
Yeah, as Telly said, I think it's hard to tell. There was one phrase that Putin used when he talked about sort of, these, broader global forces, which many people have interpreted as a kind of, anti-Semitic trope that he was trying to communicate. I don't know what's happening in terms of state-controlled Russian media because, alas, I can't read Russian, so I'm not sure if we're seeing, anti-Semitic tropes in the press. One thing I think, and we know certainly about the, the oppression and repression of Jews in Russia during the Soviet Union and anti-Semitism historically in the Soviet Union. But I don't know in terms of the present moment. But one thing I think we should be encouraged about is the fact that in Ukraine, that there is, a head of state who is Jewish and who, is a head of state in a country that is religiously heterogeneous. So in terms of the Orthodox Christian population, the Byzantine Catholic population, Eastern Rite Catholic population, the Jewish population, Ukraine is a really remarkable example of a head of state who, in many ways, reflects the religious diversity of that country. And that, I think, is something to be celebrated as exemplary, both in Ukraine and around the world.
One final question as we end, Professor Prodromou. I know that you're co-president of Religions for Peace, and this is a huge question, obviously, but I'm wondering what the pathway to peace looks like here, and how can everyday average American Christians play a part in that?
Well, first of all, I have to start with a confession. Since I teach on Tuesday mornings from 8 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., I missed this morning's Council of Presidents meeting for Religions for Peace, RFP. But I think, for any person of faith, it's incumbent upon all of us to stand against the use of violence, to stand up for international law. And I think where the war in Ukraine is concerned, it's imperative for all of us to speak, that language loudly, and to hold our own religious community leaders and other religious community leaders accountable, to be sure that they don't use compromising language or wordsmithing, but instead stand against violence. And then what can we do? On the ground, we can send humanitarian assistance, number one. I think that's really important. We can also, other things we can do, not vilify each other. And I think there, in terms of the Russian population, it's very difficult for us to assess what their views are. We see, yes, some coming out in support of the war, but others, as we said before, demonstrating. They live in a repressive, autocratic society. They live in non-democratic conditions. So it's and with a media that's largely state controlled. So I think, it's important not to sort of lump every Russian into the Putin box. That's something that I think is important for us. And then finally, I think it's really important that we, as we were asked as Christians, but in general as faith communities, to oppose escalation. Weaponization and escalation is not a solution. I mean, it's a formula for greater loss of life, the prolongation of the war, and for the very real possibility, as a colleague from, the U.S. Naval War College succinctly put it this past week when we were on a panel together, the incineration of all mankind. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to speak and act for peace and oppose militarism and weaponization. However much we may feel that, emotionally that's something that, will help the weakest party, the Ukrainian people. But adding more weapons and escalation is enhancing the possibility for a mistake or a tragic purposeful action that will incinerate a lot of people.
Professor Papanikolaou, any final thoughts?
No, but just for people to lift up their voice. That's all. I mean, the more voices lifted up, the better. So, and appreciate people tuning in to be educated and informed. It's a complicated history, but maybe it's an opportunity to, a very unfortunate and tragic one, to get to know this history in this part of the world, but just to realize too that religion, it plays a big role in politics and public life, whether we like it or not. And often bad theology is appropriated to justify certain ways in which religion should play that political role. So we just need good theology. We need theological literacy. We need religious literacy. So I encourage viewers to think about that and to lift up their voices for the people of Ukraine, but also for theological literacy, quite honestly.
Well, Professor Papanikolaou, Professor Prodromou, we're incredibly grateful to both of you for taking your time to be with us today in what is a busy and difficult time for you all, I'm sure. No,
I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to you for hosting the forum and for inviting us in to speak about an issue that's actually heartbreaking and tragic. So thank you for the opportunity to share our views, and also to your viewers for spending time thinking about this. And I hope we can all work for peace. And I hope that the next time we speak, it'll be about the war being over and
right.
healing taking place. So thank you so much.
Agreed. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to all of you for watching. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.